When it comes to proving the papacy from the Bible, the discussion sooner or later ends up discussing Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says to Peter, "You're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And so the discussion starts where Catholics start saying the rock is Peter. You see, Jesus is building his church on Peter. So Peter is the rock. Peter is that rock on which the church is built. So he is the most important authority. And he must be the Pope if he is the rock on which the church is built. And the Protestant side are going to say, no, when Jesus says that Peter is the rock, he doesn't mean that he is the rock. The rock is not Peter. The rock is the confession that Peter made. The rock is Jesus himself. The rock, Peter is a small rock, and Jesus is talking about a big rock. And like there are all these semantics that can start an endless conversation where at the end of the day, Protestants will stay on their opinion and Catholics will remain of their opinion. Why? Because papacy cannot be proven by one single verse. If you read that verse, "You're Peter, on this rock I will build my church," you will never be able to prove the papacy from that single verse. Papacy can be proven from the Bible as a cumulative case of evidence. There's not one single verse that proves papacy. There's a cumulative evidence within the Bible and outside the Bible from historical evidence that all point to papacy. Now, today I would like to bypass Matthew 16, which has been discussed way too many times and no agreement has been found, and show you how can you quote unquote prove the papacy from the Bible in two simple moves by completely ignoring Matthew 16. The first passage that I want to present is John chapter 10. The Gospel of John chapter 10, there's this famous speech of Jesus about him being the good shepherd. "I am the good shepherd, and the sheep follow me." In particular, verse 4 says, "When he," meaning the good shepherd, "has driven out all his own sheep, he walks ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. But they will not follow a stranger. They will run away from him because they do not recognize the voice of strangers." So the first concept that Jesus makes clear is that he has a flock, and that flock follows him by hearing his voice, listening to his voice, and recognizing his voice. They don't follow anybody else, they follow Christ because he is the good shepherd and his flock recognizes him as the authority that has the truth. Okay, this is the first concept. I will believe that every Christian would agree with this passage. Farther down, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." A good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. And then he says, "I am the good shepherd," again, verse 14, "and I know mine, and mine know me." So that's the other, he's stating the same concept. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I will lay down my life for the sheep. And here we come. "I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold." Here Jesus is talking about the Gentiles. So he's saying, my sheep, my flock right now is made up of Jews. Now I have other sheep that are gonna be part of my flock, Gentiles. They will be added later. "These also I must lead, and they also will hear my voice." And this is the point. John 10:16. There will be one flock, one shepherd. This is the concept. Jesus is prophesying that once the Gentile are gonna hear the gospel and are gonna be part of the church, of his church through baptism, they will become one big flock. There's not gonna be any difference anymore between Jews and Gentile. They're all gonna be part of the same church, of the same flock led by Jesus, and there's gonna be one flock and one shepherd. Who is the flock? Everybody in the church that Jesus built. Who is the shepherd? Jesus. One flock, one shepherd. This is the promise of Christ. Very clear. Now, with this in mind, what we're going to do is move to 10 chapter, actually 11 chapters later, at the end of the same gospel, the Gospel of John, where Jesus, after the resurrection, appears to his disciples, in particular to Peter and other 6 apostles, on the shore, and they're having breakfast together. All right, here we have John chapter 21, starting verse 15. Let's read. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Meaning more than these other apostles. And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. He then said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was distressed that he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, I know, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. All right, what's going on here? Jesus is asking Peter 3 times the same question. Do you love me? And probably the reason is because Peter denied him 3 times. And so he is reestablishing Peter 3 times, making that confession of love 3 times. And there are 2 things that are striking here, more than the fact that it repeats 3 times the same concept. One is the first question, do you love me more than this? Jesus is singling out Peter above the other apostles, in front of the other apostles. Why is he doing that? Well, it goes back to the Last Supper, where Peter has said, well, if all these guys here are going to leave you once you go through your tribulation, I will not. I will always remain faithful. So there, Peter was kind of confessing that he was loving Jesus more than the other. And Jesus here is asking him, look, you denied me 3 times. So are you still sure that you love me more than these other guys? And Peter says, yes, of course I do. And Jesus doesn't say, I don't believe you. Jesus is willing to give him another chance. And in fact, he gives a very specific command. Feed my lambs. And he repeated 3 times. Every single time, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Now, what's the meaning of this? I mean, it couldn't be more clear. We are at the end of the Gospel of John. Jesus has resurrected, has appeared multiple times to his apostles and disciples. He is about to ascend to the Father. What is Jesus doing here? He is obviously leaving the flock, his lambs, his sheep. Jesus obviously goes back to John 10, to the same language that he used in John 10. I am the shepherd, the good shepherd, and my sheep hear my voice and follow me. And say, Peter, I'm about to leave this world. Now I want you to be in charge of my flock. That's the obvious interpretation of this passage. There doesn't even need of interpreting anything. It's what Jesus is saying. You are in charge now. You have the responsibility of my flock. I give you the authority of being in charge of my flock. And you and only you, because you love me more than this. So it's not something that he tells to the other, it's something that he tells specifically to Peter in front of the other apostles, making sure that the other apostles understand that it's Peter that is going to be in charge of the flock from that moment on when Jesus is going to go away. Now, if you put 2 and 2 together, if you put John 10, I am the good shepherd, my flock hear my voice, and once the Gentiles are going to be included in the church, there's going to be just one flock and one shepherd, and you put that passage together with Peter, now from now on, you are in charge of feeding and tending my flock. Well, if there's only one flock and only one shepherd, and Peter is in charge of that flock, well, the only conclusion that you can get is that if you're not part of the flock who is tended, that is tended by Peter, you're not part of the flock of Christ. There's no other way around. There's only one flock and there's only one shepherd. And if the shepherd puts somebody in charge of that flock and you are not following that person that Christ puts in charge of his flock, and you decide to go away from the flock that is tended by that person that Jesus put in charge, which by the way is Peter, well, you know that you're not in the right flock because there's only one flock and there's only one shepherd, which is Christ. Who is Peter? Well, obviously, is the vice shepherd. Is the guy that is not the shepherd of the flock. He's just the vice shepherd. He's temporarily in charge of the flock of the true shepherd for the time being while the shepherd is away. This is absolutely clear. Does this prove papacy? Well, it definitely proves the papacy of Peter. Peter is the one in charge of the flock. If you're not in communion with the vice shepherd, well, you can bet that you're not part of the right flock. So if you're not in communion with Peter, you are not part of Christ's flock. First. The second step is, well, which is the general objection from Protestants. Well, even if this whole thing is true for Peter, well, it doesn't mean that automatically papacy goes down and is hereditary, is passed down to the successor. There's nothing in the text that shows that this thing, even if we're true, should be passed down to Peter's successors. Well, how do we respond to that? In fact, one of the common objections is, well, nowhere in the Bible Jesus tells his apostles there that there should be successors to either Peter as this vice shepherd of the flock or to the apostles themselves, right? So, you know, okay, Peter may be in charge for a while, but then there's no reason to believe that this authority was passed down to others. Well, the first thing to look at when this objection is raised is to see what the apostles do the very first time that one of them is out of out of the table. You know, Judas kills himself, and so they're not 12 anymore; they're 11. What do? Do they say, well, Jesus didn't tell us that we should have any successors, so I guess we're going to stay 11 because, well, unfortunately, Judas killed himself? No, that's exactly what they don't do. The apostles in Acts 1, the very first thing that they do is replacing the missing apostle. There's no other passage in the Bible where Jesus says, hey, by the way, I appointed you 12, and when one of you is going to fall away or going to die, you're going to have to replace that. Remember, you have to replace one. No, there's nowhere in the Bible. But the apostle just used simple common sense. If Jesus appointed 12 disciples, 12 apostles with a specific authority and specific task, they come to the obvious, straightforward conclusion that if one is missing for some reason, kill himself, well, the obvious thing to do is to replace that guy. And in fact, that's what they do. Therefore, you read there, verse 21, it is necessary, here Peter is talking, is necessary that one of the men who accompanied us the whole time the Lord Jesus came and went among us, beginning from baptism of John until the day on which he was taken up from us, become with us a witness to his resurrection. And so they chose Matthias, casting lot between him and this other guy, Joseph, called Barsabbas. So it's obvious from common sense. The apostles are just using their common sense to say Jesus appointed 12 apostles with particular authority and a very specific mission. One is missing. We must replace him. They're not saying, oh, by the way, Jesus told us that we. No, they're just saying it is necessary. It's obvious. It's common sense. Well, let's do 2 plus 2. If it's necessary to replace Judas, which was the worst of the apostles, how much more will be necessary to replace the guy that Jesus put in charge as his vice shepherd, Peter? That's it. That's